Power monopolization by a few countries is simply unpopular. We live in a multipolar world and need to practice true multilateralism. There needs to be greater democracy in international relations. Global affairs should be discussed by all, and the future of the world should be decided by all. We need to make sure that all countries abide by the same set of rules. The Global South is rising collectively. The global governance system should also stay up to date to give more prominence to their voices and representation.
The world today is experiencing a new Cold War, Cold War II, which the United States is waging against China. However, these two powerful countries have very different visions of international relations. The political model that Washington is trying to impose on the world is the exact opposite of the political model being advocated by Beijing. So today, we're going to compare two speeches given by the top diplomats of the US and Chinese governments. We're going to compare them back to back, and you can see how extremely different these proposals are. The Donald Trump administration wants to return to the colonial era of the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Western empires carved up the world and treated other regions as their imperial so-called spheres of influence, denying sovereignty to global South countries. On the other side, China, which has been a victim of colonialism and which is part of the global South, China wants to lift up the global South, opposing Western colonialism, and China advocates for a multipolar global order in which all countries, regardless of size, have a voice on the international stage and have representation in multilateral institutions, and in which their sovereignty is respected and guaranteed by a clearly established international law that every country must abide by. Whether or not it's a great power or a small country, all countries have to abide by the same rules.
We need to make sure that all countries abide by the same set of rules.
Again, this is the polar opposite of what the US government is advocating. Washington is saying that it wants the rule of the jungle, in which powerful countries do what they can and weak countries suffer what they must. This extreme imperialist worldview was articulated on CNN by Donald Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller.
The United States, this is sort of foundational. The United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. We're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. It is absurd that we would allow a nation in our own backyard to become the supplier of resources to our adversaries, but not to us, to hoard weapons from our adversaries, to be able to be positioned as an asset against the United States rather than on behalf of the United States.
Sovereign countries shouldn't be able to do what they want to do.
The Monroe Doctrine and the Trump Doctrine is all about securing the national interests of America. The future of the free world, Jake, depends on America being able to assert ourselves and our interests without apology.
Now, it must be stressed that these are not just the fringe views of one individual. This is the ideology that is being promoted by all of the top officials of the US government. And this was spelled out very clearly by the top US foreign policy official, Marco Rubio, who is the US Secretary of State and the second most powerful person in the US government after Trump. And Rubio delivered a speech surrounded by European officials at the Munich Security Conference this February. And it was one of the most explicitly pro-colonialist speeches I have ever seen in the 21st century. The head of US foreign policy was saying very clearly to the entire world that the US empire wants to reverse the anti-colonial struggles. It wants to undo the decolonization we saw after World War II. And the US empire wants to work together with the European empires to recolonize other parts of the world, to restore their empires. Marco Rubio did not hide it. He was very proud of that fact. Listen to how, in this clip from his speech, Rubio praises the European empires for colonizing the global South, especially the Americas. He speaks positively of the vast empires that extended across the globe, and Rubio complains that decolonization led to the decline of Western global dominance.
For 5 centuries before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, its explorers pouring out from its shores to cross oceans, settle new continents, build vast empires extending out across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it was contracting. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swaths of the map in the years to come. Against that backdrop, then as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end. We in America have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West's managed decline. Armies fight for a way of life. And that is what we are defending. A great civilization that has every reason to be proud of its history. And this is what President Trump and the United States want to do again now, together with you, to revitalize an old friendship and renew the greatest civilization in human history, to build a new Western century.
So the message is now clear. What is the goal of the U.S. empire? It is to reverse the decolonization that we saw in the second half of the 20th century, to drag the world back to the 19th century of colonialism. This was made very explicit by the second most powerful person in the U.S. government, Marco Rubio, who's not only the Secretary of State, but also the National Security Advisor for Trump. And Rubio's pro-colonial diatribe could not have been any more different from the speech delivered by China's Foreign Minister, Wang Yi. The model of international relations that China is promoting is the polar opposite. China is trying to defend decolonization, and China is promoting a more multipolar world based on multilateralism and win-win cooperation and respect for the sovereignty of small countries. Again, I cannot emphasize this point enough. If you compare Rubio's speech and Wang Yi's speech, they are the exact opposite. The U.S. wants to bring back colonialism and Western hegemony, and China wants to oppose imperialism because China has been a victim of imperialism. During the century of humiliation from 1839 until the revolution in 1949, China was partially colonized by numerous Western powers and Japan. China was invaded many times by the Western powers and Japan. And China has done everything it can since the revolution in 1949 to defend its sovereignty and to resist imperialism and Western and Japanese hegemony. And I want to briefly look at the highlights of the speech that China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave, so you can see for yourself what I mean.
Power monopolization by a few countries is simply unpopular. We live in a multipolar world and need to practice true multilateralism. There needs to be greater democracy in international relations. Global affairs should be discussed by all, and the future of the world should be decided by all. We need to make sure that all countries abide by the same set of rules, i.e. the basic norms governing international relations underpinned by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. All countries should be equal in terms of rights, opportunities, and rules, and all countries, in particular small and medium-sized ones, should be able to find their places and play their roles in international relations. To practice multilateralism, major countries in particular should lead by example. They should take the lead in advancing cooperation instead of conflict or confrontation. They should take the lead in observing rules instead of applying double standards. They should take the lead in promoting equality instead of imposing their will onto others. They should take the lead in encouraging openness instead of resorting to self-serving unilateralism.
Wang Yi initiated the speech warning that we are seeing the law of the jungle and unilateralism have gone rampant, which is a clear reference to the US empire invading Venezuela, bombing Iran, colonizing Palestine.
Over the past year, the international landscape was marked by growing transformation and turbulence, and the law of the jungle and unilateralism went rampant. Humanity has come to a new crossroads for the cause of peace and development.
And China emphasized that this is why President Xi Jinping created the Global Governance Initiative in order to reform global governance institutions based on 5 principles: sovereign equality, international rule of law, multilateralism, a people-centered approach, and real tangible action, in order to build a more just and equitable global governance system. And in order to do this, China emphasizes that we must revitalize the United Nations system, which it noted is rooted in the history of the fight against fascism and imperialism. China refers to World War II as the World Anti-Fascist War, and after it ended in 1945, the UN was created. China acknowledged the UN is not perfect. There are many problems with the UN, especially the fact that it is dominated by the US and the Western powers. However, China emphasized that the UN is important because it remains the most universal intergovernmental organization. In the UN, each country, regardless of its size or wealth, has a voice and a sacred vote, as well as obligations and equal rights. Without the UN, the world would revert to the law of the jungle, where the strong prey on the weak.
The priority is to revitalize the UN system. The founding of the UN is an important outcome of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War. The UN is not perfect in its current form, but it remains the most universal and authoritative international and intergovernmental organization in the world. On the UN platform, every country, regardless of its size or wealth, has a voice and a sacred vote, as well as its due obligations and equal rights. Without the UN, the world would revert to the law of the jungle, where the strong prey on the weak, and many medium and small-sized countries would lose the multilateral foundation, critical to their survival and development.
And this is very important. China emphasized multiple times in this speech that even though China is a massive country with 1.4 billion people and the largest economy in the world measured at purchasing power parity, despite that, China wants to respect small and medium-sized countries and ensure that the Global South also has equal representation in the United Nations. And Wang Yi emphasized the problem is not the international system itself. The problem is not the United Nations, but rather a certain country, he said. And we all know what that certain country is. It's the United States. He noted that the United States is destroying the United Nations. The US is seeking to magnify differences and disagreements, putting itself above everyone else, stoking bloc confrontation, and reviving the Cold War mentality. Now, China uses this phrase often. What they're saying is the US is trying to drag the world back into a new Cold War. And I would say that we already are in a new Cold War. But China opposes that. And China says that instead of having unilateralism and imperialism and a new Cold War, China proposes win-win cooperation. And China says multilateralism should always be upheld.
The key lies in the collaboration and cooperation of all countries. The reason why the international system is not functioning well enough lies not with the UN itself, but rather with certain countries seeking to magnify differences and disagreements, put itself above everyone else, stoke bloc confrontation, and even revive the Cold War mentality. So all these have eroded the foundation of trust, worsened the atmosphere for cooperation, and impeded the functioning of international institutions. To safeguard international collaboration and cooperation, it is important to seek common ground while shelving differences and pursue win cooperation. There is no reason why countries cannot respect each other and contribute to each other's success.
And this is very important. China defends the UN Charter because the principles of the UN Charter are respect for sovereign equality and independence and non-interference. Every country is sovereign over its own territory and controls its own internal affairs, and other countries cannot carry out acts of aggression, which the US empire is constantly doing. China has not fought a war since 1979, whereas the US is waging war every single day somewhere around the world, usually multiple wars at the same time. So China is instead proposing another kind of foreign relations based on cooperation, not conflict and confrontation, based on equality, saying countries should not impose their will on others. And then Wang Yi emphasized that, quote, the global south is rising collectively.
The global south is rising collectively. The global governance system should also stay up to date to give more prominence to their voices and representation. Time will prove that the more democratic international relations are, and the more peaceful the world is, the stronger multilateralism gets, the more effective global governance becomes.
So China's message is very clear. We should oppose imperialism. We should respect the sovereignty of the global south. We should democratize international institutions so the world is not a global dictatorship run by the US empire, which is what Washington wants. The US only joins organizations if it has veto power. The US has veto power in the UN Security Council. The US is the only country on earth with veto power in the IMF and the World Bank, which are based in Washington. The US has been basically destroying the World Trade Organization because it can't completely control it. Any organization the US empire can't control, it either withdraws or it tries to destroy that organization. So it is not in any way an exaggeration to say that the proposals that the US and China are making to the world are absolute opposites. They are the contrary of each other. The US empire wants to revive Western colonialism and unite the US and Europe by exploiting the rest of the world, the majority of the population that lives in the global south. That is the global majority, 86% of the world population. China, a global south country that was colonized for 100 years by the Western powers in Japan, China wants a new global order based on opposition to imperialism, based on multipolarity, true multilateralism, respect for sovereignty, and non-interference. And this is why it's obvious why so many countries in the global south are supporting China's vision and opposing the US empire's vision. And this is why the US empire has been resorting to extreme violence and wars and regime change and illegal sanctions to try to crush any country that stands up to US hegemony, like Venezuela and Cuba and Iran. This is the central contradiction in global politics today. If you understand that, you can understand most of what's happening in geopolitics today. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.